The job description was a masterpiece of clinical detachment. Recovery and acclimatization companion. It was a role I had perfected, a persona I wore like a well-fitted suit of armor. The terms were clear. Maintain professional distance. Provide structural support. Observe and report. My client, Theodore Maxwell, was a name associated with quiet success, a figure who moved through the world with an inherited grace I could only ever analyze from afar. The official story was burnout, a 6-week sabbatical in a quiet coastal city to recalibrate after pushing himself too hard. My job was to be the scaffolding while he rebuilt. It was a lie, of course. It was always a lie. These arrangements were never about burnout. They were about containment. My real purpose was to be a warden in civilian clothes, a silent, ever-present barrier between my client and whatever abyss they were pretending not to stare into. I built my life on these lies. My entire existence was a fortress of carefully constructed protocols. Rule 1. Never engage emotionally. Rule 2. The client's life is a data set, not a narrative. Rule 3. Proximity is a tool, not an invitation. These were the pillars that held up the sterile, orderly world I inhabited. A world where connection was a liability and vulnerability was a fatal flaw. I was good at my job because I was empty. A mirror that simply reflected the client's needs without absorbing any of their chaos. I was a professional line, drawn in the sand. When I met him, he was exactly as the file described. Tall, composed, with an easy smile that didn't quite reach the deep shadowed blue of his eyes. He wore a cashmere sweater the color of storm clouds and carried himself with a casual confidence that seemed to generate its own gravitational field. People orbited Theodore. He was the sun, and I was the dark, unlit moon, hired to keep his tides from washing away the shore. He shook my hand, his grip firm and warm, a brief, shocking point of contact that sent a jolt of unwelcome data through my system. "Elijah," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. "Glad to have you. I'm told you're the best." "I'm here to help you get the most out of your rest, Mr. Maxwell," I replied, my tone flat, professional. The practiced sound of a locked door. He waved a dismissive hand. "Theodore, please. We're going to be spending a lot of time together. Might as well skip the formalities." I gave a short, non-committal nod. Formality was a wall. It was the first and most important layer of my defense. He was already trying to dismantle it. This, I noted, would be a challenge. He was a force of nature, and my entire job was to be an immovable object. The economics of intimacy were simple. The less I gave, the more I kept for myself. And I had so very little to spare. The arrangement began with a flight. We sat side by side, a carefully maintained buffer zone of an armrest between us. I read a dry technical manual on behavioral patterns. He stared out the window, the endless blue of the sky reflected in his eyes, making them look even more distant. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was tactical. It was a negotiated peace in a Cold War I was determined to win. My fortress was intact. My rules were holding. I was in control. That illusion lasted until we reached the hotel. It was a boutique establishment, all polished concrete and minimalist furniture, designed to look effortlessly chic and calming. It felt like a high-end infirmary. The air smelled of expensive, antiseptic lemon verbena. We approached the front desk, and the polished young man behind the counter smiled a brilliant corporate smile. "Maxwell, party of 2, Theodore said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous lobby. "Reservation for the suite." The clerk's fingers danced across the keyboard. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A micro-expression. I catalogued it. Distress. Complication. Ah, yes, Mr. Maxwell. We have you here. I do apologize. It seems there's been a system error. We have you down for the King Executive Room, not the two-bedroom suite you requested. Theodore's easy demeanor didn't change, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. A subtle tell. The sun flickering. I'm sure you can fix that, he said, his tone still light, but with an undercurrent of steel. The clerk looked genuinely pained. I am so sorry, sir. We are completely booked for the film festival. There are no other rooms available. Not just here, but I've checked our sister properties as well. The whole city is full. A silence descended. It was a heavy, pressurized thing. I could feel the gears in my head grinding, running through contingencies, escape routes. This was a breach. A catastrophic failure of the established protocol. Separate rooms were non-negotiable. They were the cornerstone of the professional distance I required to function. I was about to step in, to insist on a solution, any solution, when Theodore turned to me. He had a look on his face that was a strange mix of apology and dark amusement. Well, Elijah, he said, the sound of my name a soft intrusion into the sterile space. Looks like we're getting cozy. My own voice, when I found it, was a stranger's. That's unacceptable. Theodore just held my gaze. His was a challenge. What are you going to do? Make a scene? Abandon your post? He knew, of course, that I could do neither. My job was to be discreet, to manage situations without drawing attention. He turned back to the clerk. The King Executive will be fine. And just like that, the first wall of my fortress crumbled into dust. The professional line had not just been crossed, it had been erased. We were given a single keycard. One. A small piece of plastic that felt like a grenade in my hand, the pin already pulled. As we rode the silent, mirrored elevator up to the 7th floor, I could feel his body heat from a foot away. The air between us was thick with a static charge. I stared at my own reflection in the polished brass. The man looking back was a stranger, his composure a fragile mask. He looked trapped. He was. We both were. The room was beautiful. And it was a cage. A single enormous window looked out over the slate-gray ocean, the waves crashing in a silent, rhythmic display of power. The colors were muted, charcoal, cream, brushed steel, and in the center of the room, an island, a continent, a battlefield, one king-sized bed. It dominated the space, a stark white rectangle of immaculate linen, a silent testament to our predicament. Theodore dropped his bag by the door with a soft thud. He walked to the window, placing his palms flat against the cool glass, his back to me. I stood frozen in the doorway, my own luggage feeling impossibly heavy, an anchor pinning me to this moment of profound failure. My protocols were screaming, "Abort! Re-establish parameters! Create distance!" But there was no distance to be had. The room was a self-contained universe, and he was its sun, its center of gravity. I was already caught in his orbit. "I'll take the floor," I said. The words came out sounding harsh, brittle, an attempt to build a new wall, however flimsy. He didn't turn around. He just watched the sea. "Don't be ridiculous, Elijah. It's a big bed. We're both adults." "Are we?" The thought was a traitor in my own mind. My adult self, the professional, was in full retreat. What was left was something younger, something far more volatile. I placed my bag down with methodical slowness, unpacking my few belongings and arranging them with geometric precision in the closet. My shirts hung exactly 1 inch apart. My shoes aligned perfectly. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on a situation spiraling into chaos. Control. I had to maintain control. When I turned back, he had moved from the window. He was unbuttoning his shirt, the motion fluid, unselfconscious. I watched the fabric part, revealing the smooth skin of his collarbone, the faint shadow of hair on his chest. My gaze caught on the pulse beating a steady, slow rhythm in the hollow of his throat. My own heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Observe and report," my training whispered. I was observing. But what I was seeing had nothing to do with the client's recovery, and everything to do with the complete and utter demolition of my own. He was not a data set. He was a living, breathing man, radiating heat and a scent of clean laundry, and something else. Something uniquely his. Cedarwood and salt. He pulled a clean t-shirt from his bag and turned to face me. He paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the air crackled. It felt like a confession was hanging between us, a truth about this manufactured situation. But then he just gave that small, weary smile again. "I'll take the side by the window," he said, as if we were negotiating territory in a foreign land. I just nodded, unable to speak. That first night was a study in tension. We didn't build a pillow wall. That would have been an admission of the problem, a childish acknowledgement of the charge in the air. Instead, we performed an elaborate pantomime of indifference. We each kept to our respective sides of the vast mattress, a canyon of empty linen between us. But it was a shared space, a shared territory. Every breath he took was an event. I could hear the soft inhale, the slightly longer exhale. I found myself unconsciously trying to match my own breathing to his, a desperate, silent attempt to find some kind of rhythm in the chaos. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, my body rigid. I could feel the warmth he generated, a low-grade fever radiating across the sheets. It was a physical presence, a constant reminder of his proximity. I imagined that heat seeping into my side of the bed, crossing the invisible line we had drawn. I felt like I was lying on the edge of a dormant volcano. Sleep was impossible. My mind was a frantic engine, overanalyzing every detail. The faint scent of his soap, the rustle of the sheets when he shifted his weight, the way the moonlight from the massive window carved a silver line across his shoulder. I was cataloging sensory data, but it wasn't for a report. It was for myself. It was a dangerous, private collection of truths I was not supposed to acknowledge. He was not asleep either. I knew it. His breathing was too controlled, too deliberate. He was as aware of me as I was of him. We were two soldiers in opposing trenches, pretending the other wasn't there, while the silence between us hummed with the promise of battle. The violation of the rules had happened. The boundary had been breached. And now, in the darkness of this shared cage, a new set of unspoken rules was being written, moment by agonizing moment. And I had no idea how to navigate them. I was a cartographer in a land that was redrawing its own maps with every beat of his heart. The days that followed fell into a strange, suffocating rhythm. We existed in the confines of that room, a world unto itself. The professional pretext for my presence became increasingly absurd. I was supposed to be structuring his days, ensuring he followed a recovery regimen. But there was no regimen. There was only the waiting. We would eat our meals in the room, the scent of food mingling with the ever-present smell of him. That cedar wood and sea salt that was beginning to feel like the primary component of the air I was breathing. We would sit in silence at the small table by the window, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only sound. I would watch him. It was my job, after all. I studied the way he held his fork, the slight tremor in his hand that he tried to hide. I noted the way his gaze would drift to the ocean, his expression hollowing out, becoming a mask of profound loneliness. My analytical mind tried to keep up, to process these observations into neat, clinical notes. Subject exhibits signs of suppressed anxiety. Fine motor control intermittently affected. Periods of disassociation observed. But the words felt hollow, a lie. What I was really thinking was, your sadness is a physical thing. I can see it. I can feel it from across the room. It's a weight, and I want to know how much it weighs. I want to help you carry it. These thoughts were dangerous. They were cracks in the armor, fissures in the foundation of my professional self. The unintentional contacts began on the second day. They were small, insignificant moments that my mind inflated into seismic events. Reaching for the coffee pot at the same time, our fingers brushing for a nanosecond. The back of his hand grazing mine as we passed in the narrow space between the bed and the wall. Each touch was a spark, an electric shock that left a phantom heat on my skin long after the contact was broken. I would retreat. I would physically pull back, my body reacting with a jolt as if burned. He never acknowledged it. He would just continue his motion, seamless, as if nothing had happened. But I saw the flicker in his eyes. He knew. He had to know. He was testing my defenses, whether he meant to or not. He was a rising tide, and my carefully constructed walls were nothing but sand. One afternoon he was standing by the window, lost in his contemplation of the gray waves. I was sitting on the edge of my side of the bed, ostensibly reading, but the words on the page were a meaningless jumble. All of my focus, all of my sensory input was directed at him. He turned his head slightly, not looking at me, but catching my reflection in the dark glass of the window. Our eyes met in that strange mediated space. The reflection was distorted, ghostly, but the intensity of his gaze was not. It shot across the room and struck me with physical force. He didn't look away. My heart rate spiked. My training screamed at me to break contact, to look down, to reassert my professional neutrality. But I couldn't. I was pinned by that look. It felt like he wasn't just seeing my reflection. He was seeing through the surface, past the stoic mask, past the clinical observer, and into the churning chaos beneath. He was seeing me, the real, terrified, and desperately lonely me. What does he see? The thought was a raw panic. Does he see the yearning? Does he see how pathetic this all is? This rigid control I cling to? His expression in the glass was unreadable, but it wasn't cold. It was inquisitive. It was a question, a long, silent question that I had no answer for. The moment stretched, thinning out until it felt like it would snap. The air in the room grew thick, heavy, hard to breathe. The sound of my own blood rushing in my ears was a deafening roar. Then he blinked. The connection was broken. He turned fully from the window and walked toward the bathroom, disappearing behind the door with a soft click. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat against the cool duvet, trying to ground myself. That gaze. It had stripped away a layer of my armor, peeled it back like foil, leaving the nerve endings exposed. He had seen me. And the most terrifying part was, for a split second, I had wanted him to. I had wanted to be seen. The nights were the worst. lying there in the dark, separated by a few feet of space that felt both like a vast chasm and no space at all. I would listen to him breathe. I learned the rhythms of his sleep. I knew when he was dreaming, his breaths coming in short, uneven puffs. I knew when he was restless, the sheets rustling with his constant turning. One night, I woke with a start. The room was utterly silent. Too silent. I turned my head on the pillow. In the dim light filtering through the window, I could see his shape. He was sitting up, his back to me, his shoulders slumped. He had his head in his hands. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I was an observer again, but this was different. This wasn't data. This was pain. A raw, private anguish that I was an accidental witness to. Every protocol I had ever learned screamed at me to pretend I was asleep, to give him his privacy, to maintain the boundary. But then I heard it. A sound so small, it was almost swallowed by the silence. A choked, ragged sob. It broke something inside me. That sound bypassed all my defenses, all my rules and regulations. It was a direct appeal, a signal of distress that my body answered before my mind could object. I sat up. The movement was slow, deliberate. The sheets whispered. He flinched, his whole body going rigid. He didn't turn around. "Go back to sleep, Elijah," he said, his voice thick, broken. It was an order, an attempt to rebuild the wall between us. I ignored it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor was cold beneath my bare feet. I walked around the bed until I was standing in front of him. He still wouldn't look at me, keeping his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. The confident, composed man was gone. In his place was someone lost, someone drowning in the dark. My professional self was gone too. There was no client. There was no companion. There was only Theodore, and he was breaking apart. I didn't know what to do. My training had no protocol for this. So I did the only thing that felt real. I knelt in front of him. The position felt strangely right, a gesture of supplication, of service. I reached out, my hand hesitating for a moment in the air between us, a space charged with a million unspoken things. Then I placed my hand on his knee. The contact was electric. His skin was warm through the thin cotton of his pajama pants. He shuddered at my touch, a full-body tremor. But he didn't pull away. "Theodore," I said. Just his name. It felt like the only word that mattered. He slowly, reluctantly, lifted his head from his hands. His face was a wreck. His eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, tracks of tears shining on his cheeks in the moonlight. The mask of effortless charm was utterly shattered. What I saw was a vulnerability so profound, so raw, it felt like I was looking at an open wound. He looked at me, and there was no challenge in his gaze anymore, only a desperate, pleading exhaustion. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't do this." I didn't ask what this was. It didn't matter. His pain was a universal language. My role in that moment shifted. It was a tectonic change, deep and irreversible. I was no longer the observer. I was no longer the warden. I was the protector. The instinct to shield him, to anchor him, was overwhelming. It was a physical force, a magnetic pull that was stronger than any rule I had ever made for myself. "Breathe," I said, my voice low and steady. It was the first command I had ever given him. Just breathe. With me. I took a slow, deep breath exaggerating the motion. My hand was still on his knee, a solid grounding point in the chaos. He watched me, his own breathing still hitched and frantic. "Come on," I urged, my voice softer now. "In and out." He tried. The first breath was a ragged gasp, but he tried. I kept my eyes locked on his, pouring all of my focus, all of my manufactured calm into that gaze. I was building a shield around him with nothing but my own presence. "Again," I said. He took another breath, then another. Slowly, painstakingly, his breathing began to even out, to sync with mine. The frantic energy in him started to subside, replaced by a deep, weary trembling. My hand on his knee felt like the only thing holding him together. The only thing holding me together. We stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the cold floor in the moonlight, our matched breathing the only sound. The roles had been completely and irrevocably reversed. He, the strong one, was broken, and I, the empty observer, was now a source of strength. I was his fortress now. I was his containment unit. And I realized, with a terrifying clarity, that I would do anything to keep him safe within these walls. The lie of my job was exposed. There was nothing professional about this. This was something else entirely. Something terrifying. And something I wouldn't have traded for anything. After the panic attack, the atmosphere in the room changed again. The tension didn't disappear, but it transmuted into something else. The silence was no longer a weapon or a defense. It was a shared space, heavy with the weight of what had passed between us. The unspoken had been given a voice, not in words, but in a ragged sob and a grounding touch. The pretense was gone. I was no longer just his companion. He was no longer just my client. We were two people in a cage, and one of us had shown the other his wounds. That kind of vulnerability changes the geometry of a relationship. It creates a new kind of gravity. He started to talk. Not about the big things, not about the source of the darkness that had overwhelmed him in the night, but small things. He told me about the town he grew up in, the way the air smelled after a thunderstorm. He described the worn-out armchair his grandfather used to sit in, its leather cracked and soft like old skin. They were fragments, shards of a life offered up carefully, as if testing my reaction. I just listened. I didn't offer analysis or platitudes. I didn't try to connect his stories to his condition. I just received them. I became a vessel for his words. My role as protector continued, but it was a different kind of protection now. I was guarding his memories, his small, fragile pieces of himself. He began to watch me, too. Not with that challenging, inquisitive gaze from before, but with a new, softer focus. He watched me make coffee in the morning, my movements precise and economical. He watched me read, my face impassive. One afternoon he said, "You're so quiet, Elijah. What are you always thinking about?" The question startled me. No one ever asked me that. My inner world was my own, a locked and sealed chamber. "My work requires observation," I said, the professional jargon feeling clumsy and false on my tongue. He smiled, a faint, sad smile. "I'm not work, Elijah." The statement hung in the air between us. A simple truth that dismantled the last pillar of my defense. If he wasn't work, then what was he? And what was I to him? The questions were too big, too dangerous. I retreated into silence, unable to answer. The physical space between us also shrank. We no longer clung to the far edges of the bed at night. The invisible line had been blurred, then erased. We still didn't touch, not deliberately. But the space was no longer a void. It was a potential space. One night I woke up and we were facing each other, his soft, even breaths ghosting against my face. I didn't move away. I lay there for an hour, just watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, feeling the warmth of his body, a comforting, living presence in the dark. It felt less like a breach and more like a homecoming. It was a terrifying thought. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday, a week before we were due to leave. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and the ocean was a churning, angry gray. The rain beat against the huge window in a relentless, hypnotic rhythm. The world outside had disappeared, leaving only our room suspended in the storm. We had spent the day in near complete silence, the sound of the rain filling the space. Theodore had been standing at the window for hours, a silhouette against the weeping glass. His stillness was different today. It wasn't the calm stillness of contemplation. It was a tense, coiled stillness, like a spring wound too tight. I felt it in my own body, a sympathetic tension in my muscles. The air was thick again, charged with an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. As evening fell, casting the room in deep, shadowy blues, he finally spoke. His voice was low, rough, as if he hadn't used it all day. He didn't turn to look at me. "It's almost over." I knew what he meant. Our time here. My assignment. The end of this strange, isolated world we had built. The thought of it sent a shard of ice through my chest. The idea of going back to my old life, my fortress of one, felt like a death sentence. "Yes," I said, my own voice tight. "The contract is for 6 weeks." The word contract tasted like ash. He was silent for a long moment. The rain hammered against the glass. Then he turned. He faced me fully. His eyes in the dim light were dark pools, bottomless. His expression was stripped bare of all artifice. It was just him. Raw. Exposed. What if I don't want it to be over? The question was a direct challenge. A final, undeniable assault on the ruins of my professional facade. There was no protocol for this. No training manual had a chapter on what to do when your client asks you to stay, not as a caretaker, but as something else. As a human being. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs. My mind raced, searching for the right words, the professional words. The words that would gently rebuild the walls and guide us back to the safety of our prescribed roles. "My services can be extended if your family deems it necessary. We can discuss a continuation of the support plan upon our return." The phrases were there, lined up like soldiers, ready to defend me. But I couldn't say them. They were lies. And I was tired of lying. He saw the conflict in my face. He took a step away from the window, closer to me. The space between us shrank from feet to inches. I could feel the heat of him, smell the rain on his clothes. "Elijah," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Look at me." It was a plea, not a command. I lifted my gaze to meet his. "You feel this too, don't you?" he asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a search for confirmation, for a shared truth. He was asking if I was as lost as he was, if this strange, magnetic pull that had defined our existence for weeks was real. This was the final threshold. I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I could step back, into the safety of my rules, my isolation, my lonely, ordered life. Or I could step forward, into the terrifying, unknown territory of a genuine connection. My entire life had been a series of strategic retreats. A lifetime of choosing the fortress over the field. I made a conscious choice. I did not step back. Instead, I closed the remaining distance between us. It was only 2 steps. It felt like a mile. I stopped directly in front of him, so close I could see the faint silver flecks in the blue of his irises. So close, I could feel his breath on my face. I didn't speak. My answer wasn't in words. It was in my proximity. It was in the fact that I didn't run. He let out a shaky breath, a sound of profound relief. A single tear escaped from his eye and traced a slow path down his cheek. I watched it fall, a tiny, glistening sign of his surrender, and of my own. I lifted my hand, the same way I had that night on the floor, slowly, deliberately. I didn't touch his knee this time. I raised my hand to his face, my fingers gently brushing against his rain-damp, cool skin. I wiped away the tear with my thumb. The touch was a cataclysm. It shattered the last remaining pane of glass between us. He leaned into my hand, his eyes closing, a gesture of complete and utter trust, a gesture of yielding. He was giving me his brokenness, his hope, his fear, all of it. And I was accepting it. I was holding it. The professional lie was dead. The contract was meaningless. All the rules I had lived by were gone, burned away by the heat that was arcing between us. There was only this man, this moment, this terrifying, beautiful, undeniable truth. I had crossed the threshold, and I knew, with absolute certainty, I was never going back. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not a void or a battlefield. It was a covenant. In the dim, rain-streaked light of the room, with my hand on his face, the truth finally had room to breathe. "My partner," he began, his voice a raw, broken whisper against my palm. "David, he left 3 months ago. It wasn't burnout, Elijah. It was a collapse. Everything just fell apart." The words were a confession, the final dismantling of the official story. The lie that had brought us here was now laid bare, a hollow thing. He wasn't recovering from work. He was grieving a life. He wasn't recalibrating. He was trying to survive a heartbreak that had shattered his world. I didn't say I'm sorry. The words were too small, too inadequate. Instead, I let my own truth be my answer. I moved my other hand, placing it on his shoulder, my grip firm, grounding. I was offering my own confession, not in words, but in touch. I am here. I am not leaving. I see you. He understood. He opened his eyes, and the vulnerability in them was a mirror to my own. He saw past my stoic exterior, past the years of self-imposed isolation. He saw the deep, aching loneliness that had been my constant companion. "Why did you take this job?" he asked, his voice quiet, searching. "It was safe," I admitted, the truth tasting strange and new. The rules, the distance. It was a way to be near people without letting them in. "And now?" he whispered. The question hung between us, the final, pivotal choice. "And now, I am letting you in." I didn't say it. I didn't need to. I showed him. I pulled him closer, my hand sliding from his face and shoulder to wrap around his back. I drew him into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying my face in the curve of his neck. He shuddered against me, his arms coming up to circle me, his hands gripping the fabric of my shirt as if he were drowning, and I was the only solid thing in the world. This was the surrender. It wasn't about desire, not in any simple sense. It was about need. A fundamental human need to be held, to be anchored, to be shielded from the storm, both outside the window and within. His body was tense at first, a collection of sharp angles and coiled fear. But as I held him, I felt the tension begin to bleed out of him. His shoulders slumped. His breathing deepened. He sagged against me, a dead weight of trust and exhaustion. I held him up. I was his foundation. I was his walls. The scent of him was overwhelming. Cedarwood, rain, and the salt of his tears. It was the scent of a truth finally acknowledged. I breathed it in, a drowning man taking his first breath of air. The rough texture of his sweater was an anchor under my cheek. The heat of his body soaked through my shirt, a profound and vital warmth that seemed to seep all the way into my bones, chasing away a chill I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying for years. We stood there for an eternity, locked together in the center of the room, two fortresses that had crumbled into each other, their ruins forming a new, shared shelter. There was no observer and no client, no caretaker and no patient. There were only two men, stripped of their armor, holding on for dear life. Eventually, slowly, he pulled back just enough to look at me. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes were clear for the first time since I'd met him. The shadows were gone. He looked at me with a raw, unguarded gratitude that stole the air from my lungs. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and mirrored my earlier gesture, touching my face. His thumb brushed along my jawline, a touch so gentle, so tentative, it felt more intimate than any kiss. It was a question, an offering. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes, surrendering completely to the moment, to him. The long war I had been fighting against myself, against connection, against my own heart, was finally over. And in the quiet aftermath, there was not defeat, but a profound and overwhelming peace. We didn't go back to our separate sides of the bed that night. The pretense of division was unthinkable now. He led me by the hand and we lay down facing each other, the space between us gone forever. He curled into my side, his head resting on my shoulder, his arm draped across my waist. I pulled the covers over us, cocooning us in our own small world. His breathing was a soft, steady rhythm against my chest. My own heart, which had been a frantic, panicked thing for so long, finally slowed, finding his rhythm, matching it. For the first time in years, I did not feel like an observer of my own life. I felt like a participant. I was here. I was real. And I was not alone. I lay awake for hours, not from tension or anxiety, but from a sense of quiet wonder. I listened to the rain against the window and the sound of his breathing, and I knew that something fundamental had been broken within me, and in its place, something new and infinitely stronger was beginning to grow. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun streamed through the window, painting the room in stripes of pale gold. The ocean was calm, a vast expanse of glittering blue. It felt like the world had been washed clean. I woke first. Theodore was still asleep, his face peaceful, younger. He was still curled against me, his hand resting trustingly on my chest. I watched him sleep, a fierce, protective instinct rising in me. It was a feeling I had never allowed myself to experience before. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. I didn't move. I didn't want to break the spell. This new silence was a fragile, precious thing. It wasn't empty. It was full. It was filled with everything that had been confessed the night before, with the weight of our shared vulnerability, with the promise of this new, unspoken pact. When he finally stirred, his eyes fluttered open and met mine. There was no surprise, no awkwardness, just a quiet, sleepy recognition. He gave me a small, slow smile. It was the first genuine smile I had ever seen from him. It reached all the way to his eyes, and it was like watching the sun rise. "Morning," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my own voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We didn't need to talk about what had happened. We didn't need to define what this was now. The definitions, the labels, the rules, they were all part of the old world, the world of lies and fortresses. This was something new, and it would have to be navigated moment by moment, truth by truth. We moved around the room with a new shared rhythm, a silent dance. When I went to make coffee, he got up to get the mugs. When he went to shower, I laid out a clean towel for him. They were small, simple acts of care, but they felt monumental. They were the language of this new reality. We had 1 week left. A week that had once seemed like the end of a contract now felt like the beginning of a life. The future was a blank page. The thought was no longer terrifying. It was hopeful. As we packed our bags on the final day, the movements were synchronized, efficient. He folded a sweater. I zipped a suitcase. We were a team. The room, which had once been a cage, now felt like a sanctuary. A chrysalis from which we were both about to emerge, changed. Standing by the door, ready to leave, he paused. He turned to me, his expression serious. "I don't know what happens next, Elijah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I don't want to go back to the way things were. Either of us." I looked at him, at this man who had dismantled my entire world, and then helped me build a new one from the ruins. I thought of the fortress I had lived in for so long, the cold, safe, empty rooms of my own making. He had breached my walls, not with force, but by showing me his own. He had taught me that true strength wasn't in the height of your defenses, but in the courage to lower the drawbridge. "Okay," I said. It was a simple word, but it held the weight of a vow. "Okay. We figure this out. Together." He reached out and took my hand, his fingers laced with mine, a comfortable, solid fit. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of partnership, of quiet solidarity. We walked out of the room, leaving the keycard on the table. We closed the door on the lie we had entered with, and walked out into the world with a truth that was still new, still fragile, but entirely our own. The real work, the real recovery, was just beginning. For both of us.